thoughts? Very good. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. So I'm Taya Cohen. It's cold here in Pennsylvania in the United States. It's like sub-zero temperatures, so hopefully it's nice where you are. Today I will be talking about a project on about law school actually, and I'm Stephen said I have a PhD in psychology, but for the past my whole career I've been working in a business school. But this project is in collaboration with two law professors and a practicing lawyer and a couple other colleagues who are like me from organizational behavior. And we are looking at the socialization of honesty and through law school. And so this came out of some earlier work I had done where, thinking about the different ways in which people can be honest or dishonest, things beyond just lies or deception that way. And so in this project, we'll think a lot about omission and non-disclosures, and law is an interesting setting to study that. Um, so this is a 3-year study, and I'll give you a little background of some of the questions we think are interesting. We're in the process of writing conference papers, trying to figure out the right kind of outlet for this work. I know there's a lot of interest among law professors, but I think there's some broader insights that may be interesting, say, for negotiation ethics or for work on professionalization and occupational socialization. So I welcome questions and comments throughout. So having come from a non-law background, I don't have really lawyers in my family and I don't know much about law school, so I've learned a lot. And one thing I've learned from my colleagues is that during law school, a major component of legal education, certainly in the United States, and you all can tell me how much this translates cross-culturally, because this is situated in the US, but one of the major components of legal education is to develop students' professional identity. And there's all these requirements for accreditation that law schools have and ways in which they focus on professional identity. And professional identity, a big part of that is ethics and learning the sort of the ethical standards of the profession. And the other aspect of professional identity is figuring out how to think like a lawyer. And this is a phrase that's used quite often. And so thinking like a lawyer, it's a particular form of moral reasoning that's grounded in legal text and tests. It's typically abstracted from broader considerations such as social context or morality and fairness.
Sorry. Okay.
There we go. And there's been some interesting work. This paper, Hannah Kanan from 2022 in PNAS, I thought was interesting because they were looking across different countries in the world. I forget how many, maybe 4 or so, at lawyers versus non-lawyers, or sometimes so much law students versus lay people, matched controls. And one of the things they found is that people with legal training, like lawyers and law students, they have a more textualist view, as they say, but they focus really on the letter of the law as opposed to the spirit of the law. And the idea here is this has a coordination function. It helps us all agree, well, this is the text and the words. And this is very much part of sort of what students are learning as they enter the profession through this 3-year journey of law school, and then as they start work as lawyers. And so the big question, overarching question, is how does professional socialization during law school shape aspiring lawyers' honesty and their ethical decision making? And negotiations will be the context for what we're thinking about. Negotiations are interesting to study, I think, for a variety of reasons. So one, lawyers negotiate all the time. It's a big part of their practice to settle disputes, to plea bargaining, business transactions, all sorts of ways in which people are communicating to reach some kind of settlement or agreement. And the other thing about lawyers and law students in this context is that there's ethical rules set by the profession. And I find this interesting because in a lot of occupations or organizations, there's not explicit ethical standards that everyone sort of must abide by. There's general sort of rules or expectations, but within the practice of law, to be a member of the profession, you have to learn these rules. You're tested on them. In the United States, these are called the American Bar Association Model Rules of Professional Conduct. And so the Bar Association is the professional organization that does a lot, sort of governs the profession in a way, but then the states, each of the states in the United States has regulations that are adapted from these model rules. And pretty much every state has adapted these model rules of professional conduct as the ethical standards. There's state regulations, some minor exceptions in California, but basically all 50 states have some version of these rules, almost identical to some of what I'll present here. And in negotiation, there's some rules that are very clear related to deception and honesty. So outright lies about material facts are prohibited, right? That constitutes misconduct. But questions related to non-disclosures or omissions are not as clear-cut. And there are some ethical guidelines and rules that I will show you that you have to disclose material facts, even if your client doesn't want to, because you need to prevent your client from committing fraud. So you can't. So the rules prohibit assisting clients in committing fraud. But most other things that a client tells you is confidential, right? And there's confidentiality requirements, and there can be this tension between the confidentiality requirements and the responsibility to the client in that way versus not facilitating client fraud. And these decisions then of whether and what to disclose in negotiation, they're guided by a lawyer's professional identity and their moral character. And I studied, sort of by way of background, a lot of my work for most of my career has been on moral character, trying to figure out what it is, what it predicts. And so that will come in here. Today, I'll talk a little more on the how law school in particular shapes moral character and beliefs and behaviors about negotiation. And so when you think of negotiation, there's all kinds of ways people can deceive. And there's been a lot of research in the behavioral ethics area, in psychology and business and in economics that focus on lies. Usually, these are lab studies where people can lie for personal gain. I'm sure many of you on the call are familiar with these paradigms. And so when we think of negotiations, certainly low moral character or unscrupulous negotiators will make false statements, they'll lie. But then there's these other tactics like half-truths or puffs or palters or some of the terms that are used where people say something that's technically true, but it's designed to mislead. And then the focus mostly of what I'll talk about today are omissions, non-disclosures. And I'll use those terms interchangeably. When do you correct the other side's mistaken beliefs? Or if the other side leaves something out of a contract. Sorry, excuse me, my 8-year-old just came in. I need to mute for a minute.
Then I can go.
Can we turn down the volume just a little bit?
Up,
Down.
if you want.
Yeah, how do I do that?
On the knob to the left. Yep, just turn that down a little.
All right, sorry about that. My 8-year-old and 6-year-old are getting off to school, and the 6-year-old broke the 8-year-old's jacket. So I have family here to help, luckily. All right, well, let me take a breath and take a moment here to kind of summarize what I'm thinking here about negotiations, right? There's all these ways in which people can be less than fully honest that are, beyond just outright lies. And I think some of you on the call, because certainly I know Stephen is familiar with this work, why I thought this project with law students and the ways in which they might be honest or deceive was interesting because it fits with this theoretical framework that we had published a few years ago in the Academy of Management Annals, where we reviewed all of the work on honesty and deception in applied psychology and business ethics, organizational behavior, and came up with this framework for thinking about honesty, not just as speaking what you believe to be true, so lies, cheating is what we typically think of, but all the different ways we might foster understanding of the truth in others or not. And I like this, where we came to with this framework because it highlights how communication is dyadic, right? And so whose responsibility is it to foster understanding of the truth? And in negotiations, right, there's two or more parties. And so if I know that you have a mistaken belief, you think, my plans for a property that you're selling to me are different than what they actually are, whose responsibility is it to ensure that belief is accurate, right? Is it the communicator? Is it the recipient to check those assumptions? We have the phrase buyer beware, where, you have to go into negotiation with some expectations that there might not be full disclosure, but on certain areas we think there should be, and the law even requires in the ethical standards to certain things to disclose. But there's a lot of ways in which this can be not fully clear, and that's where people's personal judgments come in. I won't talk about the truth-seeking part in my work today, but I think that's a part of what some of you in the lab have worked on, and certainly with the research coming out of your lab in particular on misinformation and things along those lines. I think that's interesting to think about that in the context of honesty. And so we wanted to come up with this holistic framework to, before the communication begins, how are people thinking about, is what they're going to say truthful or not? Do they check that? And then there's what happens in the act of speaking, and then the ways in which we may foster understanding of the truth or not through how much we disclose, what we disclose, how do we communicate that information, et cetera. So disclosure is particularly difficult when you're representing others as a lawyer or attorneys, right? Because there is a tension between truthfully sharing information with the counterparty and the requirement of advocacy, or even zealous advocacy is a term that's sometimes used, at least in the United States, to protect and pursue the client's interest. And then we combine this pressure for advocacy with the fact that non-disclosures are generally easier to defend, to justify, right? They involve inaction. It might not be as readily recognized, challenged, or punished. And there's research in psychology. The Scioli is a psych science piece from 2011 that kind of compares disclosures versus false statements, non-legal context, showing that people have more tolerance for omissions, right? Both with themselves and for others. And so what might happen during law school, what we wanted to test here is this emphasis on client advocacy combined with law students' tacit learning that non-disclosures are unlikely to be successfully prosecuted that could give rise to dishonesty through omission and non-disclosures. But there are these institutional rules and norms in place to help lawyers navigate these decisions and these dilemmas between withholding versus disclosing information. As I mentioned a moment ago, all aspiring attorneys are required to learn the ethical standards for the profession. There's a national ethics exam to be a member of the profession, right? To have bar admission, the Bar Association admission, to be a practicing attorney. You have to learn and pass a test on these rules. There's required course in law school. Again, this requirement of professional identity relates to this. And the hope is that the formal ethics training students receive will positively influence their professional identity such that they internalize the ethical standards of the profession and uphold them in practice. Now, when I've given this talk in the past, or versions of it, I had prior work where we looked at lawyers, and the title was Honesty Among Lawyers, and people said, well, isn't that an oxymoron? Are lawyers honest? Like, no one expects lawyers to be honest. And I'd say certainly that's, I think, the prevailing view among many. And one of the reasons I found it interesting in learning more about the ethical standards of the profession is that honesty is talked about quite a bit in these model rules, starting the preamble. The preamble says, as a negotiator, a lawyer seeks a result advantageous to the client, but consistent with requirements of honest dealings with others. Right? So that's right at the beginning. At the end, it goes back to honesty for saying it's professional misconduct for a lawyer to engage in dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. So at the beginning, the end, and then in the rules in between, there are other statements about honesty and fraud. So one of those is a basic statement that a lawyer should not assist a client in fraud, not assist a client in criminal behavior. The lawyer can discuss consequences of different actions, but a clear statement that the lawyer should not be assisting a client in deceiving others, through fraud. And most relevant to the current presentation the current study is this Rule 4.1, because we have designed negotiation vignettes that capture this. And that's what the law students in our study have responded to. And going back to that framework of honesty that I presented a bit ago, the requirement of truthfulness is both about not making false statements. So a lawyer shall not knowingly make a false statement of material fact or law to a third person. But there's also a statement how a lawyer shall not knowingly fail to disclose a material fact. But here again, you see where point A is very clear. Point B, it's failed to disclose material fact to a third person when disclosure is necessary to avoid assisting a criminal or fraudulent act by the client, unless disclosure is prohibited by Rule 1.9. So it kind of, it's a little bit muddled because Rule 1.6, I misspoke. Disclosure is prohibited by 1.6, and 1.6 is about confidentiality. So there are circumstances, if you know, and lots of commentary related to this, circumstances in which lawyers must disclose to avoid assisting in criminal acts. But then there's confidentiality, which is also an ethical requirement. And I have some pieces of this highlighted here where the confidentiality standards suggest that a lawyer shall basically keep information private, shall not reveal information related to the representation of the client, unless, right, the lawyer is going to prevent the client from committing a crime or fraud that's reasonably certain to result in substantial injury to the financial interest or property of another. And so when deciding about disclosures, right, the lawyer has to kind of think about, is this covered by confidentiality? Do I have an ethical requirement to disclose? What do I think is the right thing? And what we were interested here is, how do these beliefs change and form as students can start in law school at the beginning of their first year through graduation, and what factors might shape these decisions. So bring it together before I move on to tell you a bit about our data and our findings. So when we're thinking about the socialization of honesty, we, as I mentioned in the beginning, lawyers or law students, they're trained to think like a lawyer, which is very much about rules and texts. And there's these ethical rules of the profession, state regulations that define the standards, and they prohibit misconduct. They emphasize honesty. So, it's reasonable to assume as law students become acculturated into the profession, they might start to adopt these standards, right? It might start to shape their beliefs about negotiation, where their professional identity and their moral identity become intertwined. And so that could mean that lawyers increasingly align their beliefs and behaviors with the standards. But based on some prior work from my co-author, Art Hinshaw, who's a law professor at Arizona State, we had some reason to think that's probably not what's happening, and there's may not be a greater shift towards honesty and ethicality. And in particular, Art and Hinshaw and Alberts have data where they have compared 330 beginning first-year law students to 352 students near graduation at 4 different schools, with the same case, a case related to non-disclosure, where related to that Rule 4.1, disclosure is required, because if you keep that information private, you'd be facilitating fraud. And you would expect that students near graduation would be more likely to get it right, more likely to say that they would do the behavior, the disclosure that's in line with the ethical standards for the profession. But actually, they found the opposite, that the 3Ls, the third-year law students, were significantly more likely than the 1Ls to facilitate client fraud by non-disclosure. And so with that as the background, we were thinking, well, that's this cross-sectional snapshot of a few schools. What is happening related to honesty? And we wanted to embark on a big project where we looked at students over the course of their legal education. We looked at 15 different law schools and a variety of different negotiation vignettes, non-disclosures, as well as false statements, as well as honesty in circumstances where it's not necessarily required, where disclosure is not required. Like if the other side makes a mistake, they leave something out of a contract, like leave a zero off. It's not necessarily an ethical requirement for the opposing counsel to correct that, but clearly to correct that would be more honest. So how are these different beliefs changing? So specifically, we have some pre-registered hypotheses about year in law school based on sort of understanding of this context and what we thought may happen. We thought that year in law school might be associated with a lower likelihood of misrepresentation, these outright false statements, because law students will very easily and quickly learn that these agreements do not hold up. It's not a good way to serve your client, because if there is, you have lied to the other side, it's not going to move forward, it will be challenged. So it may look like more honesty, but it's also not consistent with advocacy. Whereas with omissions, we thought the opposite, where because even though disclosure is required in these circumstances, you might reasonably think that it's not going to lead to big consequences because it's not necessarily as easy to punish, even if it's ethically required. And for point C, this is a higher likelihood of proceeding to settlement without correcting opposing counsel's false impressions. And false impressions are different than what I call omissions here because there is not an ethical responsibility or ethical requirement to correct the other side's mistaken beliefs. But like if you think something is you have a different assumption, but I didn't say anything to give it that would necessarily have given you that assumption, then it's not consistent with that rule 4.1. So it's up to the discretion of the communicator here. We also had some impressions or some hypotheses about moral character. I can present some data. I won't go into these as much, just in the interest of time. But moral character, and here we looked at honesty, humility as a broad trait, as well as guilt proneness as a more specific character trait that I've studied in past work with lawyers and other populations. And we thought moral character would broadly facilitate more honesty in situations where honesty is an ethical requirement, as well as situations in which honesty is not an ethical requirement, where it's a matter of personal choice, across all these 4 different kinds of vignettes that we wrote for this study. All right, so I'll move forward and tell you about our data. All right, so here's a summary, a lot of text here, but this has the overview of what we did. So we started this project August 2022 with the first survey, and then we had a second one, January 2024 is when we launched it, and then another one earlier this spring in March 2025. And the idea is for at least some subset of students, we wanted to follow them, survey them right at basically after orientation, right at the beginning, halfway through, and at the end of law school. But we also wanted to sort of have larger samples and we can make cross-sectional comparisons as well. So we surveyed everyone at the law schools, all JD students. So first year, which is called 1L, second years, third years, and we were able to get support from law professors at 15 different U.S. law schools. So we wrote a survey announcement and we shared this with different colleagues at law schools, and then either they or an administrator from their school sent our survey announcement to all the students in the law school, and all JD students were eligible. And so what we'll be able to do here is make cross-sectional comparisons, first years versus third years, but also we have a subset of students who responded more than once. So we have 135 of them who responded at 3 time points. So every year that we ran the survey, we have a much larger group, 729, that responded at 2 time points. So maybe in 2022 or 2024 or whatever combinations. 2024, 2025. So we have some that we, have records from at multiple time points. So 4,551 records from 3,552 students. The survey took about 15 minutes. The first set of questions were the focal questions that will be the outcome variables here, related to material misrepresentation, omission, false impressions, and voluntary correction. And as I highlighted, these first 2, those relate to that rule 4.1 about truthfulness in negotiations. They're both unethical and dishonest. So how likely are you to tell the client this lie? And is what we asked in the material misrepresentation. The omission, how likely are you to proceed to settlement without correcting this? Proceed to without sharing this information, knowing that the other side had a mistaken belief, that where it would be fraud to fail to disclose. And then there's false impressions, where it's similar to the omission, but there is a subtle distinction in that in the false impressions scenarios, the lawyer, the client, did not contribute to the other side's false belief. They didn't make any statements to make the other side have that false impression. So there is not an ethical requirement according to the model rules to disclose. So it's ethically permissible, but still dishonest. And that's similarly for the voluntary corrections. Those are ones you're negotiating about a clause, and then you receive the contract and you realize they've left the clause out. Do you let them know? They're a little bit different here because there are at least some case law that suggests those contracts don't hold up, but it's not a clear ethical requirement that you have to tell them because they've made the mistake, right? So technically, the lawyer could say, well, that's not my responsibility, right? The other side made a mistake. And so I found this interesting in working on this project to think about situations where honesty is ethically required versus not. Then we have a variety of other measures, beliefs about negotiation, conflict management style, moral character, psychological well-being, and different educational and internship experiences. So I'll tell you a little bit about the vignettes. The first one, and so for each of sorry, let me go back one slide. For each of these 4 categories, we had 3 different versions. So we used stimulus sampling because we didn't want our results to be attributable to any one vignette, because of course there's particularities about the wording or things like this. So we have 3 different versions. And I controlled for which version. Every time a student took a survey, they were one of the 3 versions from each of the 4 categories were randomly selected. And so I'll present one example from each to give you an idea. And so you can imagine you are responding to these. And I'll also I have the distributions. And so overall, the material misrepresentation vignettes, this has to do with that statement from the ethical rules that lawyers shall not make a false statement. So here, you represent the heir of an estate that includes a collection of antique musical instruments. The heir plans to sell the collection. A collector is interested in the American colonial period, and your client told you to tell the collector retrace the origin of the violin to one of the few remaining produced in that period, but your client knows that the violin was in fact crafted 100 years after that time. And basically, how likely are you to tell the collector that the violin was made in that period? We have a few others where it also says your client has told you this before, but now is asking you to lie to the other side. I would say maybe fortunately, misrepresentation is not high, but I guess but it should be 0. So it depends, like, should you be optimistic or not? And so one time I was presenting this actually to a group at Oxford, this past fall, and I said, well, the mean here, it's like most students are saying very unlikely or somewhat unlikely. The overall average for material misrepresentation is only about 11-12%. And I was framing that as positive, and then someone in the audience, they said, well, that means in a hypothetical situation where stakes are low, you still have 11% of people or so who are saying, I will just commit outright fraud, when it really should be 0. So, but that is what we see. And in a moment, I'll show you the data for first years versus third years on that. Now, the omission ones, I think, are interesting. And you'll see it's not as clear cut when you look at the distributions of here that we have responses. Some people saying, yes, they'll definitely proceed to settlement without disclosing, and others are saying very unlikely. So the distinctiveness about these is that there is a material fact, that needs to be disclosed. So in this case, you represent the owner of a cheese shop. It was severely damaged during a flood. Your client closed its shop because of the water damage. In your negotiation, the client's insurance company, the insurance offered to pay the full value of the business losses based on the understanding that your client was completely out of business since the flood. In fact, after the flood, your client sold cheese out of their home. So that's a material fact that the business was not completely shut down. Your client directs you to accept the settlement offer without mentioning the sales from the home. And so if, as a lawyer, you follow the client's instruction, you are facilitating their fraud. And the average on these in general it's sort of in the middle. It's slightly below the midpoint, right? 2.79 for this one. And we have, some other versions that are similar. And, as a glance, as you can see from the material misrepresentation, there's much more variability, much more higher willingness to engage in omission compared to the false statements. Even though, according to Rule 4.1, if you're really learning those ethical rules, both of these should be 0. Okay, they're not. All right, false impressions. Here's where there is not an ethical requirement according to the rules of the profession, but fairly similar in some ways to the omission vignettes. But here, as a lawyer, you have not contributed to the other side's false beliefs necessarily. You haven't fostered that, but do you correct it? And so your major client, Sahara Properties, asked you to negotiate to buy a building that's been nominated for historic landmark status. In discussion with the seller, it's clear that they assume that you'll pursue the historic designation, although the sales contract does not say that. Your client told you confidentially that it intends to demolish the building to construct an office building. You and your client never communicated anything to Ozark about your client's plans. Ozark's attorney sends you the final sales document for your client's signature with a cover email stating, "It will be wonderful for the community when the historic status is approved." So how likely are you to make the deal without disclosing your client's plans for the building? And here, again, it's to not disclose would be more dishonest, right? You're withholding information. You're not fostering understanding the truth. On the other hand, this is not an ethical obligation per se, according to the rules of the profession. So it makes, so then thinking of what would you do? How do you handle this? And we see here, again, the most, or the average is slightly below the midpoint here. Okay, finally, voluntary corrections. These are scored the opposite way. So higher scores are more honesty here, whereas the other ones, the higher scores are less honesty. You represent a baker selling the client's bakery and all the bakery's recipes. Among other plans, the buyers intend to brand your client's unique macaroon cookies and sell them on a large scale. Your client also has a niche dessert catering business that sells these macaroons. And as part of the deal, your client agreed to stop selling macaroons through the catering business altogether. Buyer's counsel drafted the purchase contract, sent you the document signed by the buyers, but the contract is missing the language prohibiting the sale of the macaroons through the catering company. So how likely are you to tell opposing counsel that the contract's missing the language prohibiting the sale? Oh, sorry, there's the graph. And here it's, it's often about the midpoint as well. And this is scored the other way. All right. So related to the hypotheses, as law students progress from first to third year, they were less likely to make false statements of material facts. So there's material misrepresentation if we average across the three different vignettes in that category. And we looked at who chose somewhat or very likely, saying yes, like I would be somewhat likely or very likely to lie on behalf of my client. And we see about 12.5% of first year students said they would do that, and that goes down. So that's a good thing. Students are getting closer to graduation. It's down to 9.7%. Again, whether this is positive or not, it really should be zero. Especially, and I can't imagine that in practice when there's actual pressures that this would be any lower, right? When people just say, yes, I'm willing to commit outright fraud on behalf of my client. But then when, willingness to commit fraud by omission, much higher, right? 3 times. So for the omission vignettes, we have 29.1% of first years versus 36.2% of third years. So it's going in the other direction, the opposite of what we'd expect. So if lawyers were learning the professional rules and the ethical standards as they became socialized into the profession, it should be going the other way. It's not. Same direction for the proceeding to settlement without correcting the false impressions. The third year students, it's nearly 10 percentage points higher than the first year students of saying somewhat or very likely to move forward. And we didn't find any effects of law school class on those voluntary corrections, which is sort of interesting. We've got about 46.9% of the first years, 47.6% of the third years chose somewhat or very likely to correct or reverse. So it matches the scoring of the others. It's about 37% chose somewhat or very unlikely. And here to summarize, let me put the figure up, where higher scores here is more, or it's less honesty. You can call it more dishonesty, right? So the voluntary corrections are reversed and all the different categories are different. So this is what I was sharing. Between first year and second year, you do see this drop. So students are less likely to make outright lies, but they're more likely to omit information. I find this interesting based on the framework I shared earlier, because there's not a lot of work that differentiates different forms of deception and looks at the same variable you're in law school having exactly opposite effects on 2 different forms of deception. false impressions are, there's some more willingness for that. And then the voluntary corrections, as I said, I think these are a little different in that it's not necessarily clear if you move forward without correcting that it will serve your client well, because those contracts may be challenged in law in court. The contract may not hold up because there was this understanding that it was just a mistake. For those of you more technically, statistically minded, you can see how we ran the test, and I can tell you more about the models. But with the repeated measures, right, we have records within persons. We ran HLM models with random intercepts to account for the variability among people, and the nesting. We have law school controls for the 14 different law schools in our sample. We controlled for vignette versions. And then to really get the temporal aspect, we controlled for survey year as well as age. So which wave of the study did they participate in? That was not significant. Age, older people lie less, omit less. Not totally surprising to me based on some of my work on character in the past, that as people get older, they tend to be more honest generally. More higher moral character. We controlled for gender. Gender is, across the different models jumps around a little bit. In this particular model, we see women were less willing to move forward to settlement with voluntary correction. They were more likely to less likely to move forward to settlement without correcting the false impression. They were more likely to offer voluntary corrections. We didn't see differences for the material misrepresentation or omissions. All right, so then we're saying, okay, so we document this change. Well, what might be going on? One interesting and maybe discouraging, especially for law school educators, finding is that we have a lot of second-year students. We have 1,246 2L students in our sample, and about half of them had taken the required ethics course before completing our survey, and about half of them had not yet completed that course. So we're able to compare among the second years who either had or had not yet taken that course. Do we see a change in any of their responses to these vignettes? Overall, we don't see significant changes, but if anything, we see more omission. So we see a marginal effect. Again, it's 0.07. I don't want to overemphasize it, but it's going in the opposite direction you would expect, for students who had versus had not yet had a full course on learning the ethical rules. One of those rules is that you can't fail to disclose a material fact. And so the ethics course is not helping, let's say, and maybe weakly giving rise to omission, or at least associated with it. And then negotiation course, which is an elective. So that one you don't, not all students are required to take. The professional responsibility course, all students are required to take. The negotiations or alternative dispute resolution, some students chose to take. And we looked at both the second year and third year students who had chosen to take that course, who had completed it yet or not. And that was associated with significantly higher likelihood of omissions. Again, so if the people are learning negotiation, students were supposed to be taught negotiation ethics in their negotiation course, they were getting the wrong message, right? Because they were higher likelihood of omissions, not lower. One thing, what can help? I've done a little bit of work through the with the Wake Forest group on the Moral Beacon project they had some years ago, as Templeton founded. We talked about moral beacons, but who has like a positive influence? How might honesty be positively influenced? There's some reason to be optimistic that internship supervisors here, when a student had an internship supervisor they perceived to be honest, so we asked them about their internship experiences. One of the questions we asked was them to rate their internship supervisor on their negotiation approach. One of the questions we asked was about honesty. We phrased it as my supervisor would never tell a lie. So in negotiation, my supervisor would never tell a lie. We use that to get at their perceptions of honesty. And when law students had at some point during their training a supervisor who they indicated would never tell a lie, that was associated with more honesty in what they reported, in the vignettes, that they lower likelihood of omission and false impressions, higher voluntary correction, although we didn't see a change in material misrepresentation there. I can keep going and talk about moral character. So let me do that. But again, I am happy to take questions at any point. So briefly, with moral character, we study this a lot as psychologists, but also in law, there is a good moral character requirement to become a member of the profession. It's a prerequisite to becoming a lawyer. The applicant, when they apply for admission to the bar, has to prove they have good moral character. In Pennsylvania, the state where I live, persons with a record showing a deficiency of honesty, trustworthiness, diligence, or reliability may not be recommended for admission. Other states have similar requirements. Generally, what this looks like in practice is people get ruled out for prior criminal activity often and things along those lines. But there's a lot of writing within law, and certainly the early formation of this as a profession talked about how we have lawyers of good character, and it's still emphasized. And of course, in psychology, we know there's a lot of work that emphasizes honesty as a hallmark of good character. So there's this question then, well, what about the character of law students? How is that being affected by their time in law school? And there, we looked at two character traits. Guilt proneness is a scale I developed some years ago. It really gets at a sense of interpersonal responsibility. Your conscience. So you receive too much change in a store, you decide to keep it. The sales clerk doesn't notice. What's the likelihood you'd feel uncomfortable at keeping the money? Ranging from not very unlikely to very likely. And then there's this broader dimension of personality that I assume many of you on the call are familiar with, called honesty, humility. It comes from the hexaco model. Honesty is part of it, sincerity, but also modesty and greed. So we wanted to see how are these shaped by law school, and do these predict honesty? We expected they would predict honesty, given their moral character traits. So the first thing we can see is that there's a lot of stability in moral character over time. And one way we can think about the stability is, well, what about the students we saw at first year, and then they took the survey again in third year? So we've seen them now 3 years later, from August 2022 to April 2025. What is the consistency of their scores? And you can see the correlations here are high, right? 0.72. 0.68 for guilt proneness. And at the same time, there is a statistically significant but small decrease in honesty, humility over the course of law school. And so the average, so we have 162 students who completed the survey at 1L and 3L. And if you look at the difference in their scores is one way. You can, there's other more sophisticated ways we can look at their change, but descriptively, you can see on average, those students had a 3.5, it's about in the midpoint of, and then it's going down slightly to 3.42. And you can see this here. So this is more formally how we tested it with the HLM models, now with honesty, humility as an outcome. We did not see differences in guilt proneness, and we can also look at the moral character composite to make the claim that moral character is significantly decreasing over the course of law school. Again, I don't want to oversell because it's not a dramatic, it's not going from one end of the scale to the other, but it's a significant, and the other thing we can see, if you bear with this, a lot of statistics, but the cool finding from this table, if you can see my mouse cursor, is this effect of changes, within-person changes in honesty, humility, is negative 0.41 coefficient associated with more omission. And I'll just walk through this to give you a sense, because there's a lot of, numbers on this screen, but I ran models, HLM models for each of the 4 outcome variables. And for the moral character traits, you can think of both between person differences. So on average, some law students are higher in moral character than others. That's individual differences. Those are really what our hypotheses about. And you can see that students, that's what this level 2 person level findings that I have in yellow. So students who are higher in honesty, humility compared to their peers, they don't lie as much. They don't admit as much. They don't have false impressions. They're more likely to offer voluntary correction. So high moral character is associated with more honesty. We see a little bit weaker, but still significant effects for guilt proneness. It was sort of surprising here. We do have this non-significant effect for false impression. Maybe it didn't activate their personal sense of responsibility because you have the advocacy tensions. But on average, people of higher moral character are more honest, even when honesty is not an ethical requirement. And then we see this change, and the change is kind of interesting to me because as honesty, humility is decreasing in law school, omissions are becoming more likely, right? Higher. And that is significant. And it wasn't significant for the others, but that change was associated. And then we still see the law school class. This is formally how we tested that law school class is associated with less misrepresentation, more omission, more false impression. All right, let me wrap up. And I know some of you will have to go, but I can happy to take questions. So overall, what is changing? As students become socialized into the profession, they are less likely to make false statements, yet more likely to proceed to settlement without disclosing material facts or correcting false impressions. We see this modest within-person declines in honesty, humility, and this decline corresponded to a greater likelihood of facilitating client fraud by withholding material facts. Some of the supplemental analyses that we explored had to do with beliefs about negotiation, conflict management style, kind of trying to explain what's going on here. One thing that was surprising to us, really countered our expectation, is we thought law students might be becoming more competitive as they progress through law school. And some of my colleagues had even written about this in prior papers. And I'd even written about in prior papers about game framing, of thinking of negotiation as win-lose, as having arbitrary rules, like maybe thinking like a lawyer is making you think of negotiation more like a game and more like win-lose. And we actually saw the opposite in that conflict management style shifted towards more compromising, slightly less competition. So it wasn't that law students are becoming more competitive in general. They had significantly lower adversarial beliefs about negotiation. So it wasn't competitiveness per se. And there was no significant change in well-being. We thought maybe because there's been a lot written about how law students have poor mental health, but we didn't see any changes in our study due to law school class. So wrapping up, time in law school may negatively impact aspiring lawyers' honesty, but not in the belief-speaking component of honesty, not in the making false statements, right? But rather in their willingness to passively withhold information to foster misunderstanding of the truth. And so professional socialization in law school seems to curb unethical tactics, overt unethical tactics like lies of commission, while boosting subtler forms of deception related to omissions or non-disclosures. And what I think is interesting more from a theoretical or conceptual standpoint, by distinguishing these multiple dimensions of honesty, examining how moral character and professional socialization jointly influence negotiation behavior, our study clarifies how professional identity formation can strengthen some facets of ethical decision-making while weakening others. And I'll thank the different groups that have sponsored the work, and I'll maybe turn off my screen share, and if people are willing to stay around, by Stephen, I'm happy to answer questions.